Welcome to the first meeting of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee in 2014. As usual, can members and everyone in the public gallery and witnesses make sure that mobile phones are turned off, not least because they can interfere with the sound system. Item 1 on today's agenda is for our new member, Cara Hilton, to declare any relevant interests.
Nothing to declare.
Cara is, of course, replacing Helen Eadie, who sadly passed away last year. And in that connection, Helen was our deputy convener. So item 2 today is the selection of a deputy convener. Parliament has agreed that only members of the Scottish Labour Party are eligible for nomination as deputy convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. This being the case, can I invite nominations for the position of deputy convener?
Convener, could I nominate Margaret McDougall for deputy convener?
Thank you very much. If there are no other nominations, there are no seconder being required. I therefore ask the committee to agree that Margaret McDougall is chosen as deputy convener of the Standards, Procedures and Public Appointments Committee. Are we all agreed? Thank you very much. May I congratulate Margaret McDougall on her appointment. Item 3. Next item of business is for the committee to decide whether its consideration of the evidence heard on its inquiry into lobbying should be taken in private at this meeting and at future meetings. Do members agree to take this item in private today and at future meetings? Yes. We're agreed. Item 4. I invite the committee to delegate to the convener responsibility for arranging for the Scottish Parliament corporate body to pay under Rule 12.4.3 any expenses of witnesses in the inquiry. Members may wish to note that where I'm minded to reject a claim, it will be necessary for the committee to consider that particular claim at a meeting. Do members agree to delegate responsibility for arranging for the SPCB to pay any expenses of witnesses in the inquiry to me? Yes. Agreed. Thank you. We're agreed. Right. Item 5 is for the committee to take evidence into its inquiry into lobbying. I'd like to welcome our first panel today. Put my glasses on so I can see who's sitting where. Do forgive me. On the left, we have Alexandra RUNSWICK, Director of Unlock Democracy. And next to her, we have Neil Finlay, MSP. Then we have Dr. William DINAN, Director, Spinwatch Steering Committee, Alter EU. And on my right, we have Tasman Cave or Carve? Cave. Tasman Cave, campaigner Alliance for Lobbying and Transparency. Welcome to the committee. I'm not intending to take opening remarks, but I hope that if time permits, I'll be able to come to the end to make sure that if you feel there's any points not made, that you're able to make them at that stage. We run tight for time because we have to complete our day's business before Parliament starts at 11:40, and this session I'm looking to finish at approximately 10 o'clock. So if the answers and the questions can be concise and focused, we'll cover as much ground as we reasonably can. I shall also be quite careful in how I deal with any matters that are raised either by the members of the committee or witnesses that relate to the personal interests of anyone to whom they may refer. So I invite you to be cautious in that regard. I'm not expecting any difficulties in that regard, however. Right, members. Cara Hilton, I think, is going to start off with the questions.
Right. Morning, panel. I'd just like to start off by asking a general question to everyone. To what extent do you think reform is required? And obviously, there's not really been any major lobbying scandals at Holyrood. So is there a need to introduce legislation at this time?
Maybe, Convener. I think the whole thrust of government at the moment, and quite rightly, is about preventative action, preventative spend. We hear these terms being used all the time, and I think this fits very comfortably into that. That we, if you can imagine that there was scandal, what would happen afterwards? when that happened, there would be a major party political dogfight. There would be people attempting to gain advantage through a scandal emerging. And therefore, I think at the moment we are better to take action to try and prevent scandal happening in an atmosphere of relative calm where there hasn't been any major problem. So I think this is all part of that preventative action, preventative agenda that I think we probably all sign up to. And, you know, I think we have to ask ourselves a question as well as why hasn't there been any scandal emerged up here? Is it because we're just naturally much more honest, open and transparent people? I'll leave others to judge that and answer that. Or is it that we just don't know what's going on? Again, I wouldn't comment on that. I'm throwing that open as something that you might consider. And the other issue, I think, in this regard is that when there was no Scottish Parliament, there was relatively no lobbying going on in Scotland, or it was very little. But as powers have come to this Parliament, there has been an increase in the amount of lobbying going on. Now, we're due to get further powers for this Parliament, the Scotland Act, and whatever happens with the constitutional situation, it looks like further powers again will come to this Parliament. There will be a consequential increase in the amount of lobbying that goes on in and around this place. So therefore, I think if we take action now, rather than wait until we have a problem, then we would be putting in place a system that would help maintain the reputation, openness and transparency of this place.
Could I add and just come in on that? I mean, I think, you know, it's worth seeing these kind of proposals and the idea about lobbying transparency as just good practice and good governance. I mean, the OECD have been heavily promoting the adoption of lobbying transparency rules and registers and disclosure regimes as a means of promoting public trust in government and governance, and of, you know, ensuring that there's proper scrutiny of what parliaments and parliamentarians and happens in government. So I think that's important. I think nobody really knows what the situation in Scotland is because there's definitely a deficit in transparency. You can't tell. We can go onto the websites of various organisations who lobby, and they may or may not reveal what they do in terms of their approaches to government and parliament. So I think that's an issue. And I would say also in Scotland, I think we have a relative dearth of investigative media. I mean, there's very little investigative journalism goes on in Scotland. There's kind of pockets of it maybe in the BBC and one or two newspapers, but that's the exception. So I think we shouldn't be complacent by the fact that there have been no scandals, that there's no revelations in the media, that actually everything's fine in Scotland. Having said that, I think actually it's a really good time to consider these proposals. I think, you know, in terms of good governance and kind of an even look at these things, best to do it not in a crisis moment when you're reacting to something, but to actually look across the field and think, what can we do here to improve the transparency and accountability of this Parliament? I think they're very, very sound principles, and I think proposals around lobbying transparency are completely aligned to the founding principles of this institution. I think would make a real concrete contribution to actually advancing that.
If I could just add, I mean, I agree with Will entirely about the transparency point. I think the first reason to do this is because transparency in governance is a good thing, and you have the opportunity to take action before there have been any major scandals, and that is a very important point. The other thing I would just want to say is that the Scottish Parliament, as a newer Parliament, has been able to lead the way in lots of kind of democratic measures in the UK. I spent a fair bit of my time trying to convince Westminster parliamentarians to engage with what seemed like very moderate proposals like a petitions committee, which obviously you embraced from the start. And you have another opportunity here to actually set the tone for the way that things should be done and to show how an effective lobbying register can be done. And I think that's a really important step for you to take, particularly as the powers of the Parliament do increase, and we know that the level of lobbying will increase in line with those powers.
I'd just like to add something on the whether there is a real need or a perceived need, and I think they are two separate things, but they're both equally important. We focus a lot, or having worked on the Westminster proposal since 2007, a lot has been said about the perceived need, and various polls have showed that there is an issue of public trust, that people see that there is a fast track and inside lane afforded to particularly corporate lobbyists, and that people feel excluded from government. But I briefly want to talk about what I see as the real need, and this is, I suppose, going to the heart of what lobbying is about. You as MSPs will see, with respect, an absolute tip of the iceberg in terms of the lobbying activity that goes on around an issue. So the contact programmes with you and with ministers and with civil servants and regulators is without being being rude about the other bit, but that's the professional face of the lobbying industry. And what sits beneath that is a vast industry which brings in a lot of public relations and other techniques. And I wondered if you'd give me the time just to talk about a particular instance. So if you take the tobacco industry's recent lobbying over issues like point of display bans and plain packaging, and you look at the activity that they invested in, and it is an awful lot of money that they invested in this campaign to fight off these threats to their industry. They did a contact programme, a very extensive contact programme with MPs, but beneath that sat enormous third-party campaignings involving retailers and think tanks and lobbying agencies, and they invested in huge consumer outreach, things so that they would then lobby their MPs. There is an awful lot of activity that goes on beneath what you, as elected members, see. So I think there is knowing how the industry works, and having been an industry watcher for a number of years, there is a genuine, a real problem that exists that needs to be tackled.
Thank you for these contributions, which, for a first answer, were properly, reasonably full. Let's try and make them quite concise from now on. Cara.
To those responses, what evidence do you think that there is that greater openness will lead to increased confidence in the political process in the future in Scotland?
Just very, very briefly, I mean, the research evidence on this is pretty slight, but Michael Rush has published work on the Canadian system, which showed that one of the first beneficiaries of a lobby transparency system was elected members themselves and their staffs. They had a better sense of what was going on. So there's that level of it too. But I think it's worth posing the opposite question there. If we don't have this, what have we got? We've got a council of despair where people decry the fact that vested interests have an advantage in the political system. Anything we can do to kind of rebut that and show how the system works, I think, is worthwhile doing.
I think that's absolutely fair. I mean, double glazing salesmen, bankers, then politicians, take your pick who's at the bottom. The only way is up for us, and I think increased openness and transparency can only improve the standing of politics, and start to eat into that view that, we're all at it, which I think is an affront to the large number of people who are in this for very much the right reasons, and that's to help people and to make the country a better place. But so I think this will assist in raising the standing of politicians and politics.
Can I just add, I think there's a chance that countries can get left behind. I mean, certainly Westminster is well behind the curve on this in terms of transparency. We have the third largest industry in the world after Washington and Brussels, and we have no disclosure of lobbying activity. It is a different situation here, but there are now an increasing number of countries, from Israel, France has a voluntary one, Germany has a voluntary one, Poland, Lithuania. There is a head of steam behind this, and if Scotland chooses to join that camp, that crowd, I think it's a very positive. It sends a certain signal. I also wanted to mention that the actual register is going to contain information that it's not information from information's sake. It is actually very useful in terms of starting public conversations about various issues.
Can I just say, I think we'll come to the register, and that will probably form the main
Certainly.
part of our questioning today.
Yeah.
If I could just add very quickly to that. I think I would turn the question on its head slightly and actually say you can look at Westminster and see what happens when you don't act. We have a cycle that goes on, which is there is a scandal, there is an outcry, there is an investigation, and once again public trust in politics and alienation from politics increases, and yet once nothing happens, and you get back into that cycle of scandal, investigation, outrage, and yet nothing is done. And we just see that level of alienation from politics increases each time that there is a scandal, and the sense that there is very much a them and an us of a professional political class and the rest of us. And I think you have the opportunity to try and stop that. And so I urge you to learn from that Westminster model and act before there is a serious problem, rather than worrying about being preemptive. I think that's actually a very strong case to make.
I hope the panel will work with each other, because we may not need 4 answers to every question. Cara.
Hopefully in this next question the answers could be shorter. The Code of Conduct for MSPs places responsibility on members to declare in respect of dealings with lobbyists. Should responsibility to declare interest lie with those being lobbied rather than the lobbyists?
My view is that I personally wouldn't have a problem declaring anything, you know, personally, but it is the lobbyists who are attempting to influence. They're spending the money, they're making the approaches, they're involved in all the activity. Therefore, I think there is a duty on them.
Can I just say, I also think there's a practical issue there. If you look at the scope of the lobbying and who they target, the full range of civil servants, regulators, you know, all the arms of government, unless you are going to require everybody to declare their contacts with lobbyists, the more practical thing is the one that is actually doing the lobbying, get them to declare their activities. Because, you know, everybody knows that if you want, you don't talk to the minister, you talk to the special advisor, you have the contacts with them. If you have a particular problem, it's much better to go to the regulator than it is to go to anybody else. So it's you know, civil servants are heavily lobbied as well. It would be very bureaucratic.
Very, very quickly. It doesn't have to be an either or. Why not both? I mean, you know, that would give you a kind of a double lock on this. So I think, you know, not to see it as one or the other, but actually all these forms of transparency are to the good and increase kind of public confidence that the political class and the political system has nothing to hide and is happy to make these things open for public scrutiny.
Well, let me move forward. 2 questions on the register itself, George.
Thank you, Convener. I would just like to ask initially, will a register address any problems or perception of problems with lobbying?
The very fact that it makes public more information that's in the public domain now around lobbying, it addresses the perception, certainly, that there's secrecy here and that people don't know what's going on, and therefore it's difficult to hold people to account. So at that very, very basic level, of course it will. How it goes forward then really does depend on what you require people to declare and disclose in a register, and that's one of the things I think you have to weigh and consider in this inquiry, is what would be an appropriate, proportionate things to require disclosure on. I think the very, very obvious one, the one that you'd probably want to turn to, is finance and cash and how much has actually been spent, the resource devoted to influencing the political process, is the metric most of the public will initially and easily understand, and I think it's the one that should be the focus really of thinking through what would be proportionate disclosures.
It's not going to resolve every single problem, but it will help.
The other question I have, in Neil's consultation paper, he argues that the 2002, the Standards Committee, was too narrow when it focused on commercial lobbyists, and it said it was ignoring various other groups like trade associations, charities and campaign groups. The definition that I think is mentioned is professional lobbyists. Now, is this actually an agreed working definition?
This was the kind of best definition that we could come up with. We looked at a number of definitions, and this was what we felt was the best definition.
There is a consensus now in Westminster, given the proposals that are going through Parliament at the moment, which are a sham, is the best way of describing them. But there is a consensus amongst transparency campaigners, democracy campaigners, and the commercial industry that when you talk about professional, is people who are paid, and it doesn't matter whether you work in a charity, a trade union, a trade organisation, or in a large corporate, because I mean there is no difference between me as a lobbyist, I am a lobbyist, and the activities that they engage in. So there is a consensus now.
Can I just come in? Am I correct in understanding the definition that's being used is one that has actually come from the industry and is used in the industry, and none the worse for that necessarily?
The industry bodies, is my understanding, they got together and they came up with the legal definition. It is one definition. We've had another one. I haven't got a legal opinion on their definition, but I've had a look at it and it looks fine. We're
not in a position of really particularly arguing much about the definition.
No.
Right, well that's helpful.
Okay, then, also mentioned is the idea of smaller organisations using in-house lobbyists. How would this definition affect groups like that?
Well, this comes to a threshold and whether people cross over a threshold to actually force disclosure or trigger disclosure. And I mean, again, this is one of the decisions that I think the committee will have to weigh. But a small organisation that has the resource to hire lobbyists to do their work, I think they have to declare that. I think a lot of the small organisations we're thinking about, they don't hire lobbyists, but they have someone in the organisation who may do some public affairs work and lobbying work and contact work. If it's a small part of their activity, doesn't become a major part of their job and isn't the kind of key thing that they do, there's probably no need to disclose that. I think the measures we're all talking about here are measures aimed at the larger professionalised, resourced lobbying that goes on around this institution, not capturing the small charities, the small community groups, or anyone who wants to kind of interact with the Parliament. That is not the purpose of this proposals. And the evidence is in other places that it doesn't have to work like that. I think it's really a red herring, actually, this one. I can understand why people are concerned, but I think if you draft the thing carefully enough and you define the thresholds carefully enough related to whatever agreed definition of lobbying you have, that shouldn't be a problem. Again, I think the easiest metric is resource. Some of the evidence we're looking at in the US suggests that if you're spending over $3,000 a quarter, that might be the threshold. And that's just one. That might not be appropriate for Scotland. But if you think about it at that level, well, that would exclude most of the small charities in Scotland. But the larger, big national organisations would register, and quite rightly so. I was looking at Oxfam's declarations to the Charity Commission recently. Everything they declare to the Charity Commission would be sufficient for a register, I think. There wouldn't be any extra work on even a big organisation like Oxfam, and that's not to say that the smaller organisations wouldn't have to declare at all. So I don't see this as a massive bureaucratic burden. I think I would agree with what PASS came up with. All you're asking with a lobbying register is for people to disclose information that they have to hand readily already.
Could I, in terms of the small organisations, one of the analogies I've been using to try and explain this is, say a youth group, youth organisation, come to your surgery, George, and say, we haven't got much money, we hire a hall from the council or whatever, can you help us to see if the council will give us a free let for the hall? That's your normal business for a small organisation. That is not registered. But if that organisation is part of a bigger youth organisation who are lobbying for a contract or who are lobbying for a big grant that's available from government or something, and they hire a public affairs company or they do it in-house, then they would have to register. So the same organisation can affect them differently.
If I could just very briefly add, Unlocked Democracy produced a sample filing when Westminster consulted on this in, I think, 2012. And we produced a document which had all the information we want to see. So who's lobbying whom, what policy we were seeking to lobby on, and the amount, a good faith estimate of the amount of money that we were spending on that. It took us about 20 minutes to do. This does not have to be overly bureaucratic.
Would it be possible for the committee to perhaps have a copy of that?
Yes,
I
absolutely.
mean, not,
yeah. Yeah, and I will email it over as well.
I believe it was in my consultation.
Oh, well, that's fine.
But if it's not, we can provide that.
No, that's fine.
It's on our website,
Thank you.
so I will email it to the committee.
There's just one thing to add in the context of the Westminster bill that's going through at the moment. I met with a number of peers the other day, and they are obviously being lobbied heavily because of part 2 of the bill, the gagging part of the bill. And so there's a lot of NGOs, I think there's a coalition of about 120. She said she'd not had one representation saying that they opposed being on a register, which is part 1 of the bill. They all support making their lobbying open. I mean, apart from the fact that it shows all their supporters what they're actually doing. It's a kind of a marketing thing for many. So there are no fears. You do not need to go down this particular track. I don't think there are no particular fears from the NGOs that we've spoken to.
Can I just ask one final question? One of the founding principles of this place is the openness and accountability and the sharing of power. It's one of the main points of the Parliament, one of the things we're proud of. How do you think all this will work with that ideal?
I think it would enhance it tremendously. It would allow the public to see more of what goes on in Parliament, and I think it can only be to the advantage of this place as an institution.
Can I just say, I actually think it's perfectly aligned to the founding principles of this Parliament. I mean, you can't have power sharing and accountability unless there's information that people know what's going on, there's proper scrutiny. So it's a fundamental, and I think, it would be a very concrete and simple measure that Parliament could take to really enhance and embed those principles further.
Could I just add that as MSPs, it would make your job, I think, easier in that you would then have information that is not readily available. So, for example, if you'd met an alcohol lobbyist or a tobacco lobbyist and they are presenting a proposal to you, something that they want you to support, if you had a registered lobbyist, particularly with financial disclosure on it, and you could see that Philip Morris International or Diageo were spending £750,000 on that campaign, you might then start to ask questions about what other activity, what commercial impact this is going to have on them, why they might be lobbying you quite so hard. So it will give you a much fuller idea of the kind of activity that lobbyists engage in, of which you see the very tip of the iceberg.
Can we move on to some of the detail of what might be in the register then and get some fairly bullet point feedback as to what information should be on the register, what it should be compulsory for lobbyists to put on the register? Who wants to kick off?
There is a kind of a template that's been set out now internationally that people have sort of pooled their knowledge. So from experience in the States, where they've had a decent register since 1995, Canada, and it really is who is lobbying, whom they're representing, what issues they are lobbying for, whether it's regulation, legislation, contracts, policy changes, and then how much money they are spending. Will said a little bit about why financial disclosure matters, but it does show you the scale, it shows you the disparity between resources of particular groups, civil society groups and corporations. So there's a kind of a standard formula now which has been developed. There
has been some suggestion that it should include detail of meetings.
The Canadian register does. So it includes a month. The lobbyists there have to have a monthly disclosure of any meetings that they've had with officials. If there is decent record keeping within the Parliament, that might not be necessary, but it's certainly not a major bureaucratic problem for commercial lobbyists to actually just write down, I've had a meeting with so-and-so. I mean, it is the case that in Canada you can see that Philip Morris International has met the Canadian Prime Minister's Special Advisor, and what they've discussed. And down in Westminster we have to contend with the fact that the Prime Minister's advisor works for Philip Morris and he hasn't lobbied him. So, you know, we are a long way behind. So the Canadian system is very good.
Maybe just in terms of the register, I think, you know, for anybody who fills in a bulk at saying this, but an expenses form or something similar, if you're with your employer, you usually would have that on a computer. It would be running as a daily or a weekly or whatever, and you would just fill in the information. So all the stuff would be pre-populated, your name, address, company number. You wouldn't have to do that every time. You would just fill in, you know, the actual detail of what you were doing.
Can I just add, the crucial thing is it captures the lobbying activity. The one that's proposed in Westminster at the moment is a list. It's a list of names and clients. It doesn't show any information about their interaction with government bodies. So it needs to have what people are lobbying on and whom in government they are lobbying. Otherwise, you just have a list of names. So it needs to, if you're going to have transparency in lobbying, it needs to be capture the lobbying activity, not just who.
You're arguing clearly for public information being available about meetings. Does that need to be on the register, or are there other ways in which that can be provided?
I think the most effective way is for it to be on the register. I mean, just to give you an example from our sample filing that we did of what we think should be included, for example, it's that we've lobbied on the introduction of a statutory register of lobbyists, House of Lords reform, individual elector registration and party funding reform. We're not expecting that kind of a transcript of each meeting is provided with the lobbying register, but it is important that the subject area that people are trying to lobby on is included, because often it's not easy to tell. If you just know that a minister or an MSP is meeting a particular company or a particular charity, you don't necessarily know what it is they're trying to influence. Certainly from an unlocked democracy point of view, because we have a very broad agenda, there are a number of things I could be discussing with the government at any one time. admitting that I've had that meeting doesn't actually tell you anything about the lobbying that is going on. So I think it is important that you do have that policy information. And that can be included in terms of ministerial diaries as well, but you need to have both sides of it.
Could I very briefly just come back on a couple of points here? I mean, I think what we want to do in Scotland is certainly avoid the Westminster practice. I mean, where ministers disclose meetings and under the heading of something like shared interests or general catch-up, I mean, that is completely useless for the public. And actually, it just increases public cynicism. Yeah. Why aren't they actually telling us what they're really talking about? Have they got something to hide? I mean, that's the kind of question anyone would see when they see that kind of declaration. In terms of what should be declared, I'm very strong that I believe that financial disclosure is key to this. Now, not every system around the world has financial disclosure, and the way they tackle it can be quite different. I mean, the US, it's very, very detailed, and you're reporting precise expenditures. I mean, that's a maximalist approach, but it has actually maximum transparency. The European version, which they've trialled for the last couple of years, is a voluntary approach, and I think it's awful. I'm registered under the European Transparency Register. It takes me a couple of hours once a year to fill that out. And you report in bands of around €50,000. Now, there's quite a difference. We've been spending just a few €1,000 and €49,000 on lobbying. And the Alliance for Lobbying Transparency in Europe, they voluntarily declare an exact estimate of what we've done, a good faith estimate of the cost of our lobbying. It doesn't take very long. In fact, the hardest part of doing it is to remember how you did it last year. If you're doing it more routinely, it's a routine part of your administration and record keeping, I think it would be much, much easier. So I don't think it's a massive administrative burden. I think we can drill into a little of that detail. I think, you know, if you're really serious about having lobbying transparency, you want it to kind of enhance public confidence, I think you do need to tackle that question of financial disclosure. Now, I'm sure you'll hear later this afternoon from the financial or from the commercial lobbyists that this would be a terrible thing and it can't possibly be done. I don't believe that for a moment. There are consultancies operating in Edinburgh, Grayling being one that springs to mind immediately, who will probably say that kind of thing in Edinburgh, would say something similar in London. They're part of the APPC code, so they declared their clients. But in the US, where they're forced to disclose expenditures and who's doing what on particular bits of legislation, lo and behold, they can do that too.
So can we go beyond what might be in the register, what you might have to register? Because I'm interested in, once we've decided that, if we have a register, then who would administer this register? And do you have any idea from the registers that you have looked at across the world what the resource implications are? But can I just string all my questions together? I think it's probably to save time. So once we've got a register, who administers it? What's the resource implications? But then how do we monitor compliance with the register? And then in monitoring compliance, who or how do we actually police it and have sanctions?
All really important questions, actually, when you get to the detail of how this would run. I mean, just looking at the kind of Scottish political scene, I think the kind of functions of the Office of the Scottish Information Commissioner give us a kind of a model we might think would suit a lobbying transparency register. They have a compliance section. They have a public education section too, and an outreach section that explains to those who have to register how they're supposed to register. And if you remember how the Scottish Information Commissioner set themselves up after the introduction of FOI, there was a lot of work done with local authorities and public bodies who would be covered to explain to them how to comply properly and also explain to the public how this would work. I think that kind of function would be really important in any regulator or anyone who's overseeing this kind of system. Equally, the Office of the Information Commissioner has an investigatory team as well. Yeah, so they have the capacity to check filings, check complaints, adjudicate on that and look into it. And again, I think that function is really quite important. So that kind of mix of stuff of whether it's about educating people about how to comply, it's about publishing stuff in an accessible format online, I think obviously would be the way to go on this. And it's about, you know, monitoring and investigation if that's needed. So in terms of the resource needed for that, I would imagine that the lobbying industry in Scotland is much, much smaller than the entire public sector, and the organisations covered would be smaller, so therefore I imagine the resource would be much less than is required, say, for the Office of the Scottish Information Commissioner. But I don't think this thing can be done on the cheap either. I think if you try to introduce a cheap register which isn't properly maintained and monitored, it would lose respect very, very quickly and would actually undermine the whole purpose of setting the thing up. I think if you're going to go down this route, you have to actually make that commitment, and I think it should be funded from the public purse. I don't think it should be funded by charges. But that, you know, this is the cost of democracy.
The costs, though, if I can add, are not astronomical. The Canadian system has a very good system of monitoring. It has a very sophisticated register. And I'm going to have to say, from memory, it costs them 2 million, but I can't remember if it's Canadian dollars or pounds. So I could come back to you with the figures. The European Voluntary Register, which has a number of staff, that costs significantly less. And I've got figures on the US one. I don't have them with me, but I can send them to the committee, and you'll see that it's. I mean, Andrew Lansley in Westminster has come up with some quite silly figures. 4 or 5 million. This is. Well, depends how much we spend on the IT, but it's. I can't imagine how you would spend that much on a system, even if you had a good monitoring team in place.
Yeah. Can I?
Sorry, if I could just briefly add that from the public perception point of view, the important things to bear in mind are that the register needs to be independent of both government and the industry, that it needs to be fully searchable and accessible online. The Scottish Parliament's already much better than this than Westminster, but Westminster has a really bad culture of just publishing things in obscure PDFs in the digital equivalent of the cupboard under the stairs. That is not going to encourage trust in politics. So it needs to be independent, and as Will has already said, the regulator needs to have the ability to investigate. I agree with Will that the Scottish Information Commissioner's Office would be one way of doing that. At a Westminster level, we've already also suggested it could be done through the Electoral Commission, because they already have responsibility for party funding databases and regulating that function. But the Information Commissioner's Office would also be a viable model.
Maybe add, if you look at the way in which councillors have to operate in terms of the Standards Commission and the way in which you register interests and all that kind of thing, you don't have people in raincoats and magnifying glasses peering around corners and checking on what you're doing. You register, and then there's only an issue if there's a complaint. And I think we need to get into that culture, because this is about a culture change, that people should be registering. You don't have somebody checking every form coming in to make sure, and then phoning up and peering round corners. There's a lot of this about people taking responsibility for their own actions and declaring what's going on. Also, I think there's an opportunity for those who maybe didn't reach the threshold, who could voluntarily register. That they could say, actually, I think, OK, I haven't reached the threshold, but I think, given that I have been doing X, Y, or Z, I think I should register this, and that would be a good thing also.
To pick up the Information Commissioner, what about the Commissioner for Ethical Standards and Public Life? But also, what about the SPPA, us, ourselves? Would it be relevant for us as a committee of the Parliament to be doing that? You talked about the Electoral Commission. We're actually going through a process where the Standards Committee will be doing work that used to be part of the Electoral Commission's work on overseeing individual MSPs' involvement. And just two other things. Why not a fee? Why does it have to be funded out of the public purse? And to Neil, if it's going to be that we register and it's only if there's a problem it's looked at, what are the sanctions for not having registered what you should have done?
I'm not particularly precious about who oversees it. I certainly think it should be independent of Parliament.
Parliament?
Yeah.
So okay.
Independent of politicians, let me say, political influence. I think it has to be independent. Sanctions, I think there would be a system of sanction that would rise according to whatever had happened. So, it might be a slap in the wrist to begin with, and right up to suspension or exclusion from the register, depending on the severity of the problem. So I think you would have a range of sanctions. I think that's just logical.
Can I answer the question about fees and why should it not be funded by the industry? Because, it's primarily one of practical. There is a principle at stake in that lobbying is a good thing. It's a democratic right. There should be no barrier to anybody coming and speaking openly to government. But there is a practical issue. We obviously I want to be on the register as a charity. We want to see everybody who is a professional paid lobbyist on the register. Now, if you are an organisation with one full-time lobbyist, and we think that should be the trigger to register, there should be no barrier to them registering. There should be no financial burden there. It should be something that should be carried by the public purse. For the larger agencies, it will be, they could swallow it. But to get everybody who we think should be on the register on it, there should be no barrier, financial barrier.
Richard?
Thank you, Convener. My apologies for being late earlier. Can I turn to the point that Mr Finlay made a minute ago, and I'll go back onto my hobby horse about the Standards Commission. You said that basically it wouldn't be a problem, and most of the time it's very few complaints. Have you ever been complained about to the Standards Commission?
Yes.
Yes. Well, as you know, a lot of people go through a lot of pain, and most of the time it's actually politicians reporting other politicians rather than the public. The Standards Commission costs £750,000 a year to run. Do you think the Standards Commission are able to take this on board?
As I say, I'm not precious about who should take it on board, who's best to run the register. I think that there's a number of possibilities. It could be the Standards Commission, it could be the Information Commissioner, it could be other organisations that have been mentioned. I'm not particularly precious about that.
I turn to, if you allow me, Convener, Tasman Cave. You made a comment a minute ago about it's democratic for lobbyists to lobby MSPs or MPs. Basically, would it not be a situation that some MPs or MSPs may say, well, if this is going to be flagged up, I'm not going to meet with this lobbyist?
Yes, possibly. Yes, I can imagine that will happen. I mean, I see this piece of legislation. I mean, a statutory register of lobbyists is incredibly straightforward in that it's a list. We're looking for a list, is what we're looking for. But it's not a comfortable measure for government. I think it's like freedom of information disclosure. It's good. It needs to be done for in any modern, healthy democracy that you need to have this kind of disclosure. That doesn't make it a comfortable measure. So there will be some people who will see that they don't want to disclose with whom they're meeting.
Turn that question round and say, well, because we don't have registration, then people may be frequenting with people that they shouldn't be.
Can I bring in Margaret McDougall, who I think is going to develop some of the points that we're beginning to engage with?
Okay, thank you, Convener, and good morning, panel. We've touched a little on thresholds. So, what is the panel's view on the monetary amount and the time spent before an organisation should be registering?
We all have exactly the same view on this, but I'll give you my view if that's going to help. I'm slightly more sceptical about time spent on lobbying as a good metric for triggering disclosure. Some of the evidence we're seeing in the United States, where they have this 20% threshold, is that people work on particular issues for less than 20% and therefore don't have to disclose. So I think we've got a problem with that. If we just have a simple metric like resource devoted to that and an estimated cash equivalent of that, I think we've got a good chance of having a metric that everybody understands readily and that's fairly easily calculated, because most organisations are conscious about bottom line issues these days and have to measure these things anyhow. So disclosing what part of that is relevant to lobbying and putting it in the public domain, I don't think is an issue. Where you draw the threshold, I think, is an issue that we need to be sensitive to. What is the industry like in Scotland? What would be appropriate to capture the larger organisations that we think are significant? Now, again, I've seen some work in the US which estimates about $3,000 per quarter. So that would be $1,000 a month, kind of, as a threshold. That's one potential one. Some organisations that might be small change to. For other organisations, that's very, very significant. But I think, that it's a judgment the committee will have to come to what they think is proportionate and applicable and relevant to the Scottish context. But bearing in mind, I think everyone agrees, we don't want to capture small organisations who do very little lobbying as one-off. But we are looking at trying to capture and disclose the more systemic and resource-heavy lobbying.
Can I just add, Scotland has the advantage of that a lot of countries have been doing this for, or a number of countries have been doing this for a lot of years. So definitions have been tested out, tried, reworked, and there is a discussion at the moment about the time threshold. So you have a time and a financial threshold. So this 20% rule that they have in the US, Canada has lobbying has to contribute a significant part of somebody's duties in order to trigger registration. It misses a lot, and for example, if you're a CEO, you don't spend 20% of your time lobbying, but you could have that one meeting with the minister, the very significant minister, and it would clearly be a lobbying meeting and probably quite significant. So there is a move, as I understand it now, towards not having a time threshold, but having simply a financial threshold. And I think in terms of where you put that here, you do it in consultation with, for example, the charity sector and small businesses. And obviously you would need a legal definition, but the one that we've used is the rule of thumb, which is if you've got a full-time public affairs person, we think that should trigger registration around that mark.
Undoubtedly, this is the difficult area in this, and I recognise that. And I think the proposals that put forward were our best proposal that we looking at what was going on around the world. One of the issues that came up from the industry was about the financial registration, and saying, you know, it would be very difficult for us to put that in writing, but surely when they go out for contracts, they have to tell their clients how much time they're going to spend on X, Y or Z activity. Therefore, that part of breaching the threshold should be very easy for those within the industry.
I mean, there is an issue that's often raised about this in terms of commercial confidentiality and how much detail do you actually need. And you know, the solution to that has often been that you disclose in various bands. Now, the European system of €50,000, I think those bands are too wide. But as a principle, in a way of kind of addressing that concern about commercial confidentiality, that you might want to narrow those bands significantly to maybe something like 5,000.
Do you think there should be a distinction between consultant lobbyists and in-house lobbyists? Should all be treated the same?
We can keep that really simple, no, and I think the evidence from elsewhere suggests that too. The Austrian system, which was introduced just a year ago, the lesson they're drawing immediately from that is those kinds of distinctions do not work, are very unhelpful. So you want to have approach this in a kind of a principled way, right? Everybody who lobbies should have to disclose. That's the cost, if you like, or the price of engaging in public affairs. That is, you know, that's what it is. Whether you're coming from a consultancy background, whether you're a lawyer who does public affairs, management consultant, NGO, charity, whoever, you know, all these people should be forced to disclose. And making those kinds of distinctions is deeply unhelpful. I mean, if you look at the European Transparency Register, and it's got those kinds of different demarcations, it's really, really difficult to figure out who's doing what. The level of declaration is quite different for some of the different categories. So lawyers have a kind of an exemption out of that, and most lawyers are boycotting this anyway. They don't like that.
Just raised something. My next question actually is who or which organisations should be exempt, and what should be exempt from the register?
I mean, I think we said I need to get the list, but.
There's a lot of munitia in, you know, the European one, for example. Yeah. So what should be exempt in your view?
Things like your constituents going about normal constituency business, that, you know, that would be exempt. Journalists, I'm trying to remember from memory the list, but it's in the consultation document. If you give me 2 seconds, I'll find it and I'll let somebody else answer.
Things that have been exempted, if the government asks an outside organisation for information, so the request comes from government, well, that can be exempt. Participate in inquiries like this, for instance, that's often considered exempt. You know, there's a whole list of exemptions you can draft. Yeah. Other countries have stuff like their diplomatic service, anything to do with diplomatic service is exempt from that kind of disclosure. I mean, it's up to the polity in question to decide what they think is relevant to disclose and not disclose. But in principle, you know, if you're trying to capture organised lobbying to influence policy making and the climate of public opinion, well, you're going to need to capture the activities that underpin that.
I think the key thing with exemptions is around this area is, having followed the debate in Westminster for quite a while, is not to get led down certain roads. There's been a lot of talk about, but what about the vicar who goes and sees his MP? Would he have to register? Well, clearly not. No. I mean, this is about professional paid lobbyists. Many of them doing it, and the majority doing it in a commercial for commercial gain. So there are a number of roads that you will probably be led down that are dead ends, really.
If I could just add, the important thing is to focus on the lobbying activity, as people have already said. This is not about somebody working for an agency being bad, somebody working for a charity being good. What we want is transparency in lobbying, and that's recognising the breadth of lobbying activity in Scotland and in the UK more generally, and having that openness across the sector, not just for a specific element of it, which inevitably means that you will miss most of it, particularly if you try and differentiate between in-house and agency lobbyists.
One of the issues that's raised by organisations like SCVO is that their argument is that the voluntary sector is only there to perform public good. But that's a matter of opinion, because the activities of one charity, they may deem their activities as being good and in the public good or in the public interest. Another organisation, who can also be a charity, may have the completely opposite view. Therefore, I think when you start to get into exemptions, that is very difficult. But I was just checking the consultation document. The exemptions that we had were lobbying by public officials acting in their official capacity, organisations participating in parliamentary business, for example, giving evidence to a Scottish Parliament committee, so these people would not have to register this activity. Administrative requests by lobbyists, for example, the status of a policy where no attempt is made to influence, communication by media workers in the course of their work, and a speech article, blog or social networking group that is made widely and publicly available. These were the exemptions.
Cameron.
Good morning. Sorry I'm a bit late. I was a bit late. Are there any other measures that can be taken in requiring MSPs to publish details of the meetings, do you think?
It's been suggested by some in the industry that you just resolve this by publishing MSPs' diaries. I personally don't have a problem with that, but what will my diary tell you for today? Well, it would tell you that I was appearing before this committee, that I'm meeting somebody from a housing organisation later on, and that it's my daughter's 18th birthday and I have to meet her in a restaurant later on. That's what it would tell you. It wouldn't tell you what we spoke about. It wouldn't tell you the policy area we were on about. So the information from an MSP's published diary would be very, very limited.
With respect also, I mean, an MSP would not know what the other activities these lobbyists are engaged with. So, I mean, they can only declare what they're conscious of, right? I mean, one of the benefits of a wider disclosure regime is that you've got a much broader awareness of what's going on across the entire Parliament and where influence has been brought to bear.
We shouldn't really bother with the diary. In fact, I just think it's going to be counterproductive in this case.
It's worth doing. It's a good transparency measure in of itself. It's necessary but not sufficient. If what you want to do is capture lobbying activity, it's not going to tell you the full story. But it's a good thing to do in of itself. It just won't give you the full picture of lobbying. You need to have both the lobbyists and the people that are being lobbied.
I'll give you one just maybe practical example of where that would be a useful measure. Is if you adopted a threshold, say less than 20% time of someone employed by a company devotes to lobbying, they don't have to disclose. Right? But if the CEO has a meeting with a minister and the minister has to publish that diary and the thing, there you've captured that activity there. It doesn't get captured in the 20% of the threshold for the register, but it's captured in the ministerial diary's publication. So I think, you know, a mix of these kinds of transparency measures are likely to give the public and whoever's outside the institutions and interested in these things the best possible picture of what's actually going on.
So you could put both together, you'd say, yeah. Diary and the register.
Exactly.
Yes.
Combine them. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Richard, I think you were supplementary.
Yes, and some other questions.
Yes, it's actually on that point. I actually worked for a company where I had to, as area manager, I had to fill out a diary and then I had to do a retro diary because my day-to-day situation changed. You know, people used to say be flexible and use the time. Do you not feel we'll be spending our lives filling in diaries?
No, I don't think you would. I'm personally not calling for MSP's diaries to be published, but if that's what was decided in the legislation, I wouldn't have a problem with that. If you look at the way in which Parliament has, with a small piece of technology, you can, I'm sure many of us do, on our website, there's a wee gizmo that puts all your latest speeches and questions and everything automatically. I'm sure a very small technical fix could have your diary running if that was necessary.
Yes, but what if you actually, it's happened to me when I worked with a finance firm, I had to actually update my diary the following week because my situation had changed during the, I gave my advanced diary, but when it came down to filling in, I actually had to amend it because a lot of things happened during that week.
I personally don't think it's a huge issue.
Well, anyway, I'll leave that on the table. In regards to the bill that's presently going through the House of Commons, and started and was introduced on the 17th of July. And any lessons that can be learned from the passage of this bill? Many, I'm sure you'll tell me many. Are there any elements of the UK bill not covered in the Lobbying Transparency Members' Bill proposal that should be covered by legislation of the Scottish Parliament? And I've got another question after.
The question is, don't do what they're doing.
Yeah. I think that is the single most important lesson that you can take from the Westminster Bill, which is don't try and regulate in this way.
Sorry, please. Sorry, yes. The proposal that's currently going through the House at the moment is, I mean, they've described it as a kind of a small net with massive holes in it. So it's been dubbed the 1% bill. I mean, we're trying to think of different ways to describe what is actually, I mean, I've called it a fake register, a sham register, a pretend register. It will not deliver on many levels what they've said it will do, which is opening up lobbying. One, that it lacks breadth. So it is really honing in on consultant lobbyists, so only those lobbyists for hire, and then only a proportion of those. So if your business is not a significant, they've changed the wording slightly, but if it's if a significant your business is a significant part of it isn't lobbying, then you would escape. Although I think they might have tightened up. So that includes, for example, people like the tax lobbying team in Ernst & Young. You have to remember that the accountants, the management consultancies, the law firms, they all have lobbying teams that act on behalf of third-party clients. There's a question mark about whether they'd be covered, and that is a significant part of the industry. They're small but very effective in terms of getting tax breaks for their clients, for example. So there are that loophole. There is it's only if you meet a minister and a permanent secretary are you required to.
Now a special advisor. And
now a special advisor. Are you required to register? I mean, no lobbyist will meet a permanent secretary. Very few will go straight to. I mean, you don't go straight to the minister. That's not how the industry works. You will go to the special advisor, but that excludes then anybody who's lobbying a junior civil servant, as most do, or a middle-ranking civil servant. That wouldn't trigger registration. So we have an issue with breadth. Then you have an issue with depth. So that's in terms of the amount of information that it will cover, and they really are only asking for the bare minimum. So it's not even who you are; it's who your clients are. So if you're a third-party agency lobbyist that triggers this threshold, you've met with a minister, and you need to register your clients. But what they're not saying is that you shouldn't. Anybody working as a lobbyist for that particular lobbying agency will not be required to register, only a designated person. So I think it's directors, shadow directors and secretary have to actually register, which is a nonsense. So just to finish on that, you would not see any of the revolving doors. So, for example, there's a big health lobbying agency that hires Andrew Landley as his special advisor. In fact, he's been in and out of government and this particular health lobbying agency. He would not be required to register. We'd have no idea of his activity. So it's how not to write legislation.
Yes, I agree that I don't think we should follow any examples laid down by the House of Commons. But anyway, are there any examples of good practice in other jurisdictions? You spoke about Canada. That the committee would find helpful to consider?
The approach that we've taken is a sort of a mix of Canada and the US. They've had years of experience of this, and they have equivalent lobbies that we have. We have a very sizable industry, actually an industry in London that is international in its reach in terms of lobbying and public relations. So we've taken a bit of them all in that. The US register is very good and it has financial disclosure. The Canadian one doesn't, but it does have this extra requirement that on a monthly basis lobbyists have to register their meetings with officials. So I think it's worth looking at both. You cannot take one and just cut and paste it into your parliamentary system. It will need to be adapted. But the fortunate thing is the lessons have been learnt. And like I said before, there is a head of steam around this. There is an awful lot of advice. And there is a kind of a template being produced actually now, coordinated by organisations in the States of how to do this. So there is an advantage of not being first, but I would say the Canadian and the don't look at the Australian one. That's what the Westminster government's done.
Thank you, Colleen.
Right. Thank you very much to our panel. I said I would hope to provide some time for any matters you thought we hadn't covered that we should hear. I think it's about 100 words for each of the four of you. If I, going on my time, Mr Finlay, if you wish to start.
Can I just say thanks to the committee for having us this morning. Just one observation that I did smile at the beginning was that the committee would take its deliberations over this in private. Given the subject matter, it may be that the committee might want to reconsider that and hold it in public, given that we're talking about openness and transparency.
Is that your 100 words, Mr Finlay? Yes, thank you. Alexandra Runswick.
Say, you asked what lessons could be learnt from Westminster, and I think one of the challenges for this committee is actually to look at what has happened in terms of select committee inquiries in Westminster into lobbying, because we've had a number, and what has tended to happen is that they've come up with very detailed, very thoughtful conclusions that have been used to push this issue into the long grass. And I think one of the challenges for you as the committee is not just the policy recommendations that you come up with, but what then, how that is used and what happens to that as a policy agenda.
Dr DINAN?
Just very, very briefly, I mean, I think this is, to me, it seems like unfinished business of the Scottish Parliament. I was around researching this issue the last time the Parliament inquired into this, where they decided that, you know, a register would be an appropriate thing to do. I think the industry has changed a little bit since then. It's bedded down a little bit since then. I still think it's appropriate to have a register. I think it would definitely aid the transparency of this institution. I think a voluntary system would be a disaster. They just simply do not work. They don't cover everyone. The people who want to avoid disclosure by not joining them. So the one key lesson I would take away is if you're going to do this, it has to be a mandatory thing, and the key thing in the mandatory system is financial disclosure.
Tamasin?
Very quickly, just to reiterate Alex's point, if you look at the history of lobbying transparency regulations, certainly in Westminster, first calls for them in 1969, and what triggers it is you have scandal, you have inquiry, you have procrastination, delay. You have scandal, inquiry, and it has gone on pretty much every decade since 1969 in that model. I would be very heartened and optimistic if you didn't follow that pattern.
Thank you very much for your attendance. To Mr Finlay, of course, I say that you're very welcome to stay for any of the remaining public sessions today, and indeed at future meetings where I will, of course, be prepared to call you to ask questions if you have them after the committee members have had their say. So thank you very much. I suspend this meeting for a brief interval to change witnesses. Let me welcome our second panel for today. We have on my left Alistair Ross, Secretary for the Association of Scottish Public Affairs, Iliam Costin-McCabe, Chair of the Association of Professional Political Consultants Scotland, and Andrew Watson, who's the Chair of the Public Affairs Group Chartered Institute of Public Relations. As with the previous session, I won't invite opening remarks, but allow the opportunity for concluding ones if time permits. And we'll go straight to questions. Once again, I'm going to try and finish around 11 or shortly thereafter. Cara.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, panel. I'd like to start off by asking to what extent you think reform is required. Obviously, there's not been any major lobbying scandals in Holyrood, so is there really a need to introduce this legislation?
If I can begin, I think if there is going to be regulation, if there is going to be a register, then it does need to be introduced with a clear understanding of what it's looking to achieve. I don't think, I agree with the previous panel, there hasn't really been very many issues in Scotland. But what I would like to clarify is that the scandals and issues that have been referred to at Westminster, as well as actual scandals which arise every now and again, there are also a number of ongoing issues and concerns that are covered by the media. And having had a quick look through, I'm not saying this is in any way comprehensive, but in the last 20 years, I identified 33 issues relating to concerns about access and influence, which includes lobbying activity, but isn't just about lobbying. Now, of those 33, 2 incidents involved commercial lobbyists, and a further 4 involved in-house lobbyists. So the majority of concerns and issues raised about access and influence aren't actually to do with lobbying activity per se. So I think there needs to be an understanding of that aspect, that issues about openness and transparency go much broader than simply about lobbying. I think a register...
Can I just come in and say, in the interests of openness and transparency, would you be prepared to share your analysis with the committee? Thank you.
Yes, I would.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just to add to that, I would make the point that we already have some regulations in place in Scotland. There's an MSP's Code of Conduct, which the members of the committee all adhere to. There's a ministerial code, and there's a code for civil servants. And if there is to be any regulation brought forward, I would want to understand how that actually fits with the existing regulatory structure that we have. Is it going to cut across that, and is that going to be an additional layer of regulation, or is it going to seek to address any gaps that sit within that? I think that's an important question if the committee considered, I would suggest.
If I could just add to that as well, the CIPR approach over the last decade and more has been to pursue a joint approach of transparency and of signing up to the UPAC register, which all CIPR members are required to do, and also a voluntary code of conduct, which we think sets a very high bar in terms of professional standards of CIPR members. In addition to that, there's a suite of training and education which is provided by CIPR, which is looking to increase the professionalisation of the lobbying industry across the UK. So we feel that the voluntary approach is working, sets a very high standard, might not be met by any statutory register or code of conduct, and we feel that this voluntary approach is demonstrating that that approach is working in the fact that there hasn't really been any issues in Scotland over the course of the last 14, 15 years.
Good morning. How do you monitor the voluntary approach? That's the voluntary disclosure. That's the problem, isn't it? I mean, if people don't want to declare it, they don't have to because it's voluntary. I mean, surely the mandatory thing means it has to be declared.
Well, the thing about the voluntary approach is a good question, is that if it's, to some extent, is self-selecting because people choose to join the CIPR or the APPC or ASPA or any number, or you could join all 3 of them if you were so minded to do so. As a member of the CIPR and as a member of these other organisations, you are required to adhere to a code of conduct. As a member of the CIPR and other organisations, you are required to sign the voluntary UCPAC register. But I think what this is showing, Mr Buchanan, is that the industry takes these issues of transparency and ethical standards very seriously, and long before there was any discussion about a member's bill or a government bill in this place, or any BBC Panorama stings which took place just before the summer of last year, the CIPR and other organisations like ASPA and APPC were in the driving seat of trying to improve standards in public life. And again, what we heard from the previous panel is that the definition of lobbying is one that came from industry. So industries came together, said this is what we feel our definition of lobbying is, to aid transparency and to drive up standards.
I don't think you might answer the question. What I meant is, what happens if you don't want to belong to one of these organisations? That's it. You don't have to. If it's voluntary, and you don't have to then belong to one of these organisations.
That's true. And obviously in Scotland and across the UK, not everyone who lobbies, the Westminster Government, MPs, MSPs, the Scottish Government, is a member of any professional body. What we would say is that by being a member of the CIPR or a professional body, you are signing up to a very high standard of professional standards, which you're required to meet. If you don't meet those standards, you can be expelled in a very public way. And therefore, to answer your question directly, you as an MSP, if someone is coming to speak to you to lobby on behalf of a client or an in-house company, perhaps what MSPs should be asking is, who are you? Who are you lobbying on behalf of? And are you a member of a professional organisation? And if so, why not? Because obviously being a member of CIPR means that they have to comply with fairly rigorous codes of conduct, which drives up professionalisation. If those people don't want to be a member of these organisations, then there may be a reason why, and as an MSP you may want to get to the bottom of why that is.
But if they're not a member, if they're not a member of that organisation, I keep pursuing the point, what's to stop them lobbying you? Nothing. That's why surely a mandatory register is better than a voluntary one. I cannot see the point that a voluntary one is going to, if somebody does not want to join but still wants to speak to you, and you're going to ask them a whole list of credentials when you meet with them, surely a mandatory one is better, isn't it?
Again, I come back to the point that over the course of the Parliament since 1999, there haven't really been any issues, and we feel that's because of organisations like the CIPR and ASPA driving up standards in lobbying. In terms of voluntary approaches, then yes, it's a self-selecting bunch of people who may not want to do it. But the problem is, if you were to introduce something like a statutory register, which we're not against, but we think that the statutory register or codes of conduct should go over and above what we've got, as opposed to setting the bar lower. The problem is that if you introduce something like that, then you almost have, instead of a disclosure access, which is saying, I'm lobbying on behalf of this company or these companies as a consultant lobbyist, you have an access register, which means the only way you can come in to lobby this place and you as MSPs is if you're on this register, which is effectively a licence to lobby.
It only takes one scandal, doesn't it, to throw the whole thing up, and that's the problem.
Well, I guess the point about the recent so-called scandals, and various people in their written evidence referred to scandals, the recent scandals which took place in, I think, May and June of last year, didn't involve lobbyists. They involved members of the House of Commons and journalists. And I guess, to some extent, the issues of openness and transparency in lobbying, and also in terms of professional and ethical conduct in lobbying, is that you as MSPs are effectively the gatekeepers of this. Some of this is up to you to determine what isn't an appropriate level of contact, and therefore whether you are happy as MSPs to go ahead with that. And I think what we saw with Westminster was MPs who were possibly prepared to take payment for doing work which they would otherwise do in the course of their duties as an MP. But no lobbyists were involved in that.
Chair, say we've got a panel who are of one mind on this, but it's clear from the written evidence there are others in the industry who are very supportive of a register, and I in particular cite, if I've read it correctly, a contribution from Invicta. Is it fair to say there is a diversity of opinion in the industry, and perhaps Ilium's dying to come in?
If I may go back to the previous question as well, I think that you might be able to say that there is a diversity of view. I think there are differences of opinions within. I think within a kind of small framework of what we're agreed on. But I think certainly. I don't want to comment on any individual's views on that, but yes, there is a diverse range of views, and certainly at APPC Scotland, our view was that if there is to be a register, then it needs to be a register of lobbying activity, not a register of lobbyists. And I think, to go back to the previous question, the register that was outlined by the previous panel, register of lobbying activity, would actually therefore be a very different register to the ones that we, as organisations, currently have. We have a register at APPC of our members and who their clients are and who works for them. Now, that is a register of members of the Association of Professional Political Consultants. That does not mean, if you look at that register, you know who is lobbying for who. Not all the clients that I register as a member of APPC are clients I lobby for. Lobbying is just a very small proportion of what professional consultants do. And that's one of the other aspects I would like to clarify, is that when you talk about full-time lobbyists, as the previous panel did, I'm not too sure there are any full-time lobbyists, people who spend all their time lobbying. It's a small proportion of a broader range of activity. But it would be a very different register that you're talking about. If you're looking at introducing a register of lobbying activity, that would be very different to the kind of registers that we operate. But at the same time, I would also suggest that any kind of register, whether it's of lobbyists or lobbying activity, would not have helped to prevent any of the 33 issues or scandals or concerns that have been raised at Westminster over the last 20 years over access and influence.
Let's move to quite crisp answers, just to manage time. Mr. Ross.
Happy to try and do that, Convener. Just one very small point, and we may come on to this later in terms of how a mandatory register might be used. And that's something that wasn't really broached in terms of the previous session. But I would have concerns if we started to say that some people visiting the Scottish Parliament had to be registered for whatever purpose and others didn't, because you're then starting to create different tiers of individual in terms of their access to Parliament. And in terms of a register that required the industry to pay a fee in order to become, what some people might say is an approved or an accredited lobbyist, and then use that, to distinguish themselves from others and say, well, I've been approved by this Parliament and I've been able to lobby this Parliament, I would have grave concerns about that, because that actually comes right the way back to one of the principles of the Parliament in terms of the consultative steering group, which is equality and fair access of all the people.
Can I come to George to develop the issue around the register?
Okay, then you'll probably have heard some of the questions asked earlier on, but the first one I'll ask is, do you believe our register will address the problems or the perception of problems? We heard from the other speakers earlier on, and I just wondered what your opinion of that was.
If I can perhaps answer first on this one. I think it's important to distinguish that we're talking about the Scottish Parliament here, and so I'm not sure how useful it is to refer back to examples from Westminster, which is very different in terms of culture and operation and regulation, and other jurisdictions, be they in the United States, Canada, or where else. And you look in the Scottish Parliament, because in part it is a new institution, is very open, is very transparent. I think there's a good, robust legislature in place here. I think that the work that lobbyists do, and people that are involved in public affairs generally, isn't about influencing MSPs. I think it's a very important distinction to make here. I think it's informing MSPs as they go about their business. I think it's important that when MSPs are considering legislation or regulation or the business that comes before them, that they take a balanced and informed view. As lobbyists, we don't think that we have undue influence over MSPs. I don't know of any lobbyist that would realistically claim and say that they have that. we try to inform you and help you to do your job. What we want to see is the legislation that Holyrood passes to be on the most sound evidence base possible, to be the most informed and of the highest possible calibre it can be. That's what we're looking for, and that's what, you know, certainly the vast majority of people that I work alongside and deal with are doing. So there may be perceptions. I mean, it was interesting, Dr. DINAN in his evidence referred to the research base as being slight. And I think, you know, there's certainly a lack of evidence that we're able to refer to. I looked back in my preparations for today to the 2002 committee report from the then Standards Committee, and I noted that they'd actually done some research with MSPs. I don't know if that's something that the committee has considered to canvass their peers to see what their thoughts and opinions are in terms of whether there are real or perceived problems around lobbying. I would suggest that's maybe something to consider.
When asked about the definitions, Neil Finlay, obviously in his consultation, mentioned that it was 2002, as you quite rightly said, it wasn't, he didn't believe the focus was enough, it was commercial lobbyists only, and it meant a lot of groups like charities and campaigning groups weren't included in that. How do we actually, you know, the definition that Mr Finlay used was professional lobbyist. Was that something you would recognise as well as a description of individuals in your industry?
I think this is an area that needs some work, and, you know, certainly happy to help the committee on that and look forward to the committee's considerations of it. But almost everybody has a different definition of what lobbying is. You know, I mean, we heard earlier on about, you know, the concept of chief executives as lobbyists, and the problems that TAMASIN have highlighted in terms of capturing that activity. There are a lot of people who will do some lobbying as part of their overall role, you know, because they may be a press officer or a communications manager or something like that, but they will also have other responsibilities. And indeed, lobbying itself fits within, you know, the wider kind of communications industry. You know, lobbying is something that sits alongside internal communications, stakeholder management, media and press relations, and all these other areas. So I think it's important to get a definition of lobbying that works, and we're certainly, in terms of ASPA, quite open-minded on what that could look like. I think we're maybe getting hung up in the distinction between consultant lobbyists and in-house lobbyists. You know, a lobbyist is a lobbyist is a lobbyist, I would suggest. And again, from an ASPA point of view, we want to see a level playing field.
I totally agree with that, and I think certainly one of the areas where I feel Mr Finlay's proposals were a very good starting point was on the basis of defining the scope of a register based on lobbying activity, the activity being the trigger, rather than a job title or a proportion of a person's paid work being dedicated to doing something that might be considered lobbying. I think if you start from the point of view of the activity being the trigger for a register rather than a job title, that's a very good starting point.
Let's ask a final question. As Alistair Ross touched on it, is obviously the founding principles of this Parliament was the openness and transparency and access to everyone. I've been involved in various committees and organisations where organisations have lobbied and actually managed to make a difference in the stuff that they've done. So I would say, do you think that any of this any of these lobbying ideas or this register would have any difficulty with us, the founding principles of the Parliament, being able to actually still be that open and have that access?
I think there is a question in my mind about how one group of people, in terms of lobbyists, however we define them and then register and categorise them, have got to do something different to everybody else. You know, again, one of the other founding principles is equality. You know, one point I would like to make clear is that I don't think any lobbyist I know is looking for preferential treatment. You know, there is no argument or case for, as is, you know, sometimes the case at Westminster, lobbyists have passes to this place. I don't think there's any need for that at all. Neither, however, do I think that lobbyists should be disadvantaged or, you know, obstacles or barriers put in our way, because as I say, what we're doing is trying to inform the Parliament and the MSPs.
Mr Ross, you've mentioned twice that a register would perhaps take away the equality principle of access to this Parliament, but is part of the reasoning behind having a register for lobbying activity is that if you're a professional lobbyist, it's not an equal playing field from like a local organisation of, you know, mums that have come together that want to campaign for something. They don't have the professionalism, they don't have the resources, and that's You know, so you've said that the register would impact on equality of access, but actually I think what Mr Finlay's probably trying to do, one of the principles behind what he's trying to do is actually to ensure equality.
I wouldn't want to give the committee the impression that I'm saying that would happen. I'm saying that that's a possibility, and I would have concerns about that. We would look to see how the committee, in association with the government, who's going to be bringing forward the legislation at the end of this process, presumably, would address that. I mean, that would be a concern that we would have, that might be an implication or an unintended consequence of this. But I think one of Holyrood's greatest strengths is that it is incredibly open. It is very easy. It's an easy institution to get into. You know, in comparison to the process that you have to go through to get into the Houses of Parliament in London. This is a very accessible institution. The business is displayed, as Alexandra Runswick had referred to earlier on, in contrast to some parts of the UK Parliament and Government. All the information here is displayed very openly and accessibly. It is very easy to go onto the Parliament website. I mean, in contrast to 2002, when the Parliament last looked at this, there's been a transformation in terms of not only the information that's available online, but access to online information. So I think it's very straightforward and easy for any individual to find out what's going on at Parliament, to identify what might apply to them, to get in touch with MSPs. I mean, MSPs, again, in contrast to MPs, are incredibly good at actually responding to correspondence, be that written or email, you know, telephone calls. MSPs are a lot more accessible. And I think, together with the developments in areas like social media and the way that can be used to actually gather people together around a single cause or an issue or a campaign, and they can then assemble. I mean, I think if you were to look in the parliamentary diary in terms of the calendar of events, you would see that there's a tremendous throughput of visitors to this Parliament, and that includes still groups, community groups, and it would hazard a guess it would probably actually outnumber the amount of lobbying that's done in here. In terms of professional lobbyists and the kind of areas that we've been talking about in the last few minutes.
Mr Finlay?
Yeah. I mean, the idea that there is equality of access, that's been a good example that Fiona raised about, say, a group of mums or something campaigning on an issue, that there's equality of access with them and you guys and the people you represent. The idea that there's equal access there is just absurd, because you have the professional contacts, you know the system, you know the way, you've got access to the people. You know, what you do, and for your clients, they are investing in you. It's an investment. They expect some sort of return. They don't come in here and hold receptions and give people free glasses of wine and canapes and all this kind of stuff, and hold exhibitions and all that kind of thing. That's not just some bit of fun. They expect some return on that, surely. That's why they're doing it.
I'm fairly certain that there are very strict rules around the types of exhibitions that are permitted within the Parliament, and certainly that would exclude any commercial organisations. In terms of the access, the information's all there. You know, your contact information is available on your page, on your website. The committee's contact information is available. The contact details for the clerking team. You know, it's all there and set out there. You know, yes, you know, because this is our job, we spend a lot of time learning this and understanding this, but all the information is out there, and I don't think, to use your term in terms of investment, it's not a terribly big investment in terms of time for people to actually go on to look at that, to come to an MSP surgery, to ask questions, and then take forward the campaign.
It's understanding what I'm saying. If one of your members is engaged by, say, a corporation or whoever to do a piece of work, they're not doing that just for a piece of fun. They expect some return on that investment. They expect something to happen as a result of that. Or is it just a case of, let's go and tell information to MSPs? Well, sometimes it may be, but in the main, they want something to happen as a return for that investment, surely.
I think anybody who comes to this Parliament to either give evidence or engage with MSPs and the Parliament as a whole is expecting something to happen. And I think that applies to Fiona MacLeod's group of mums visiting the Parliament as it does as much to anybody else. Sorry, I'm maybe not quite understanding the point that you're making.
No, I mean, it's okay, it's okay. Carry on, Kavira, we'll come back to it.
I think Margaret McDougall in, I think.
Could I just ask for clarity? Are you here representing the members of the Association of Scottish Public Affairs, or is this a personal view that you're giving?
No, I'm here in my capacity as Secretary of ASPA, and we circulated a number of drafts of the submission to this committee around the organisation, took on board comments, and that's led to the appearance here today.
So that's the view of your organisation? In
my capacity as ASPA Secretary, as I'm speaking.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Let's move on to the detail of what might be in the register and ask your view of what should be in any register in detail, and in particular whether it should contain detail of meetings. That was in the previous session. You heard quite a bit about that, and of course getting the balance between providing information that's useful and the effort and bureaucracy involved. Who wants to start? Gilliam? Yep.
Yeah, certainly, as you know from our submission, our starting point is that we certainly don't think a register would tackle the issues or perceived issues you think there may be about lobbying, but what it can do is increase openness and transparency, and to that extent we would certainly welcome a register. It would need to be conceived in that context so that that is its objective. And that being the case, so we put our thoughts to what kind of information we could readily submit to such a register, and what would increase openness and transparency, certainly about our members' activities in relation to contact with parliamentarians, ministers and civil servants. So in brief, it was the date of contact, the details of the registrant, if lobbying has been undertaken on behalf of a third party, who that third party is, who was contacted, what the subject of the contact is, and whether or not, if you are lobbying on behalf of a third party, whether or not you are a member of a regulatory association with a code of conduct. Those are the kinds of information that would be available quite readily, and certainly in terms of the impact on our members, who I need to add are mostly either sole operators or small businesses. It would not be overly onerous to provide that information. What I do think is there's perhaps a misperception about how readily available our revenue from for lobbying activity would be to get hold of, because certainly in the context of the work that we do for clients, there's no such thing as a lobbying contract. The contract is normally about a broad set of communications objectives, which not only, well, it can incorporate communications with MSPs and with government, but also includes a broader range of activities as well, including media and stakeholders. It can be, yes, it can be focused on trying to influence a piece of legislation or a policy idea that you might want to get onto an agenda, but more broadly speaking, it can also involve just trying to communicate maybe a new range of services your organisation is looking to introduce, or some activity you have going on in a specific region or constituency. So it's not always about lobbying. And because the contracts operate in the way they are, they're broad communications contracts, it would be very, very onerous for me to have to work out on any quarterly basis or a monthly basis how much money have I got from that particular contract, how much time have I spent doing something that would be considered to be registrable as a lobbying activity, work out how much time I've spent, divide that up, come up with a figure. It would be onerous for me to do that on a regular basis and with all the clients. So I think the other thing about that is it would be unverifiable information. How would anyone go about checking whether or not that information was accurate? So for those two reasons, I would have a difficulty, I think our members would have difficulty with there being any requirement to have precise financial information on a register.
Do the larger organisations representing larger public affairs and lobbyists organisations have the same degree of reservation?
If I could come in on that point, I think our starting point on lobbying transparency and a register is the UK Public Affairs Council register, the voluntary register, the UPAC register. We believe that provides a useful degree of transparency, both in terms of transparency to the public about which companies are which consultants are lobbying on behalf of particular companies, or if you're an employee in-house, which company you happen to be working for, and also to MSPs, in terms of if you have a meeting with a consultant lobbyist, you know who's on their books at any given time, albeit if a consultant is looking to set up a meeting on behalf of a client or to attend a meeting, which they do very seldom, then I would imagine it would be very unusual for them not to explain who they were representing and what the purpose of the meeting was. And I'd be very surprised if MSPs were agreeing to a meeting without that information. I think in terms of the register, again, UPPAC register is our reference point. The register, any register that's coming forward, should be universal, so it should apply to consultants and in-house. It should apply to any professional lobbyist who is paid to do that work, and there should be no distinction between who pays that money. In terms of financial thresholds, I don't think that's necessarily very instructive in terms of understanding the behaviour, because it really doesn't matter how much money is being spent. If you're lobbying, and as Neil Findlay alluded to, if you're lobbying, you're trying to achieve some certain outcome, then the financial, how much a company or organisation has paid or how much it's prepared to spend is really a matter for them, and where they see the value coming from. And then finally, I think in terms of a register, I think we need to be very mindful of a myriad of unintended consequences, one of which, again, Mr Findlay, you alluded to earlier, would be about who's meeting whom. And one of the problems may be that if this is going to be published, then MSPs might not want to meet with companies or organisations that they feel their constituents or members of the public or members of the press might give them a hard time for doing so, which then has issues in terms of understanding the implications of a particular policy change or change to legislation. And also, there needs to be a recognition that oftentimes these meetings take place with other people who have a completely different view, for example, the health lobby, but also is trying to inform the debate, and as MSPs looking for information from, for example, a big energy company about energy policy because they don't have that policy resource within their staff team or within their opposition team.
You all have registers of members. You refer to this UCPA as well. So if we're going down the route of there is a register to be set up in Scotland, can I ask you to use your existing experience of maintaining registers of how do you resource them, how do you monitor them, and do you have any sanctions against any of your members? And I'm thinking very much as your professional bodies, I'm a member of a professional body as a librarian. They have sanctions against me if I don't do what I'm supposed to do on the register. Thoughts? And perhaps just outline thoughts, and you could provide us with greater detail.
If I can maybe start with that. In terms of ASPA, we publish a list of members on our website, and that's organisations that are affiliated to ASPA that have paid the membership fee and have joined. And that covers both organisations and individuals. We have a code of conduct, which is again published on the website. In terms of sanctions, there are a range of sanctions. We have it in our constitution that we can, if a complaint is raised against a member, constitute a disciplinary committee and look at that. And obviously the ultimate sanction is ejecting them from the organisation.
Okay.
Yeah, as APPC, as I indicated previously, our register includes information about the members, who their employees are and who their clients are. They're also required to sign up, importantly, to a code of conduct. And if there's a failure to register in time, update their register entry, then obviously they're given an opportunity to get it in at an extended date. But if it continues to be a failure, then you're ejected from membership. In terms of the code of conduct, we also have a complaints procedure, and if a complaint is received by a member who's felt to possibly have breached the code of conduct, then we have that's an external independent adjudicator looks into that on our behalf.
Again, from a CIPR point of view, we share many of the same mechanisms. I think from the perspective of the UCPAC register, one of the important things is it's searchable, so you can type in a name or a company and find any relevant data that relates to that individual person or that company. In terms of the Code of Conduct I have in front of me, the Code of Conduct of the CIPR runs to 24 pages. Sanctions for failure to comply with the Code of Conduct is up to and including expulsion. And if we were to exclude a member from the CIPR, we would do that in a public way. So from a reputational perspective, if your profession is to be a professional lobbyist and you're excluded from the Chartered Institute of Public Relations in a very public way, then that may have a fairly detrimental impact to your career.
Richard? Yes, thank you, Convener. As an MSP, I've tried to be open, transparent and meet with everyone who's phoned my office and trying to fit them in sometimes on a daily basis is quite hard. I had to refuse someone last week because I didn't even have 20 minutes. Do you feel that really we're going into a situation where we're taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut? And I'll come back to the point that Neil Finlay made. We get invites to functions just to go along and see what these companies are doing. OK, they maybe supply a canopy and a free glass of wine, but I'm not there for the wine. I'm there for to see what these companies are doing. Will that then reduce the amount of people? Because I could attend a function in different parts of this building on every night. I also have a situation where if I'm on the Health Committee, a company over the year could actually contact me 4 or 5 times to give me advice on, and it's advice, not lobbying. Because as a humble backbench MSP, I don't think I can change the government's view. Do you really think we're taking a sledgehammer to crack a nut in this?
I think it's important to make sure that whatever the committee recommends and is brought forward is proportionate. And as we've already seen, most of the references to scandals and bad practice have been from outside of Scotland and from outside of Holyrood. As I said, to keep it brief, I would think as long as the solution is proportionate, that's the key thing to bear in mind.
If I might add to that, as I said earlier, I think that a register has to be conceived in the right framework, and if it's being brought forward with a view to trying to avert scandals in the future by anybody behaving in an unethical or inappropriate way in terms of contacting politicians, then it will not achieve that. The various codes of conduct that we have, our organisations, do not prevent anyone from doing it. If there is anyone out there who is able to behave in that way and wanting to do so, then they will do so regardless of that. A register will not prevent it from happening. What a register would do is increase openness and transparency, and if that is the objective, then I think that's a laudable objective. But it has to be brought forward in that context. You're not going to crack any nuts with this in terms of preventing any future scandals or issues or concerns about inappropriate access.
The question is perfectly legitimate and it raises the question about a sledgehammer to crack a nut, but it is irrelevant because the government has agreed to legislate. That's the agreement of the government. So whether it is or isn't is quite frankly irrelevant. However, the point I want to make to the panel was you mentioned about your own register and disciplinary procedures and all the rest of it. Have any of your members breached the code and been disciplined or suspended from your organisation or anything like that?
ASPA was set up in 1998 and short answer is no.
I'm not aware of any recent. By recent, I mean within the last couple of years.
That's terrific because that gives us a lot of confidence, and that would therefore lead me to assume that none of your members, should they be asked to be on this type of register, would fall foul of it. So therefore, I fail to see why anyone should have any fear by being on any new register that's developed.
Okay, I think we've got a point. Yeah, I'm just trying to make progress. Fiona, you wanted to come back?
Yes, I just want to. You all have registers, you've described them all to us, but when we asked you about the resource implications for a register, a public register, none of you were able to give a cost to it. You must have costs that you apply to your own registers. I wonder if you could supply us with that just as a help for us to kind of work out how this should be funded. And the last one is giving you a wee chance. If we have a register, who do you think should maintain it? We've heard about the Information Commissioner, Commissioner for Ethical Standards and Public Life, or even the Scottish Parliament itself, possibly through this committee. Do you have any thoughts?
Mr. Finlay.
If I could start on that, in terms of costs of maintaining the UPPAC register, then I think what we said in our written submission is it depends on what comes forward. So the cost of the register will depend on what the register does, how often it has to be updated.
Just for the sake of, we're short of time, what I was asking about was the registers that you currently maintain of your own members. You must put a cost against that. Don't bother telling me now, if you could send that to us.
Right. Okay, Margaret McDougall.
Thank you. We've touched a little on thresholds. Could you give me your views on what the monetary value should be and the time value on the thresholds? I know you said it would be difficult, but every organisation can break down the time of their employees, surely, or...
Personally, I would not like to see any thresholds. The Unlocked Democracy submission proposed that organisations which have fewer than one full-time equivalent lobbyist or working on lobbying, or which spend less than $6,000 per quarter on lobbying, would be exempt from disclosure. Well, that would be me, and I do not think that I would want to be exempt from a register. And I think in terms of clarification, if the register is about openness and transparency, and it's about making clear who it is who is providing information to politicians, which is part of the decision-making process around legislation and around policy, around regulations, who it is who's actually communicating with them, I think if you start introducing thresholds and saying, well, we're going to make sure that these people register and that the public can know that these people are talking to politicians, but these people over here don't need to register. You can potentially then create a situation where there's a meeting with two sides of an argument, both presenting to a politician their views, but one would have to register and one wouldn't. The impression the register would then give would be a false impression as to what's taken place. And I don't think that would be good for openness and transparency. I think it would actually be misleading. So our view is that there should be no thresholds.
Right. Anyone else got a view on that?
If I can just touch firstly on time, I think it would depend on what you're including and excluding. Do you include presumably the time spent actually meeting the MSP or the Minister of the Government official or whoever else? Do you spend the time preparing for that? If you're very efficient as a worker and you're very good, you're going to take less time. If you're going to an excessive level of depth, you're going to take more time. So I'm not sure how useful a metric time is. And in terms of financial information, I would have reservations, even Mr Finlay's proposal about banding as opposed to specific rates, because there are a number of factors that it won't take into account. I mean, two I would suggest are market forces and demand. If, for argument's sake, somebody came to any of us to ask us to do a piece of work and it had a particular deadline that was very imminent, they wanted to pay a premium to make sure that I got done on time and to the required standard, they might be prepared to pay more than the job's actually worth. Similarly, I know a few of the witnesses, Mr Finlay, have touched on large corporations. I think anything around finance would also overlook market forces, and it may well be that some organisations might use their purchasing power to actually get a much fairer deal for them in terms of the amount of money that they're spending. And again, would that be taken into account within these, even the financial bands that Mr Finlay proposes?
And just from what you have said earlier, do you think there should be a distinction between professional consultant lobbyists and the in-house lobbyists? No distinction, and you're all agreed on that. Thank you. The other question is on exemptions, and you touched on that. I think we heard from you, Mr McCaid. Would the others like to give their views on whether there should be exemptions or not from the register? You don't think there should be any exemptions?
No, I think there should be exemptions, yes, but not thresholds. Certainly, as was proposed previously, an exemption for constituency members talking to their constituency MSPs on constituency business wouldn't be registrable.
I think it would depend on the case being made for the particular class of exemption. You need to consider that on a case-by-case basis. But as I said before, lobbying is lobbying, whether it's being carried out by one of the people here in front of you, one of the people in the panel previously, or any other individual.
Right. A few final crisp questions, Cameron.
Fine, thank you. Okay.
Richard.
I'm fine too, Chair. Convener.
Could I just ask one?
Yes, of course.
If I could just ask one further question. I mean, you each individually, as organisations, have registers of your own. So do you not think, in the interest of public equality, openness, access for the public, that it would be better if we had one register? Because I'm sure the layperson out there doesn't know about your registers, and they can go in and find who's on your registers. So do you think it would be in the interests of the public to have this register?
I say that, again, they're performing different functions. The register being talked about here is a register of lobbying activity. What we have is a register of members of the Association of Professional Political Consultants. Political consultancy is not the same as lobbying. Lobbying forms a part of what we do, but it is not everything that we do. And I think that's certainly one of the issues I would like the committee to be able to take away from this, that professional lobbying or consultant lobbyist. I think consultant lobbyist is often used to refer to people who provide public affairs consultancy or political communications consultancy. It's not the same thing. There's a much broader range of services we provide to clients which are not lobbying activity. They're not the same. It's very misleading to conceive of them as the same thing. So our register actually performs quite a different function, and it wouldn't be transferable in that respect.
I would hope that the work of the committee would enable other MSPs and also the general public to have a better understanding of what lobbying is and isn't. But in terms of a single code, I'm sure that's something we could work together on.
Can I thank the panel for its input today and offer you the opportunity I offered the previous panel, about 100 words, not necessary to say anything if you don't feel there's anything more you need to add. Alistair Ross?
Thank you very much. I mean, as I said earlier, I think there's an important distinction to be made between informing and influencing. I don't necessarily agree that the latter happens. MSPs tend to be, educated, intelligent individuals with very strong minds of their own. I think our responsibility is to inform them so that they're then making decisions on the best possible basis. And as I said earlier, I think the recommendations of this committee, I'd hope, would be proportionate. Legislation could be a blunt instrument in this case. I wouldn't go as far as saying a sledgehammer, but it could be a blunt instrument. And we do have existing codes and a regulatory structure that I know the committee will take into account.
I'd certainly like to echo that. I would like to say that APC Scotland and APC does maintain a very high standard with its code of conduct for our members. We recognise that there is a problem in that not every practitioner out there signs up to a code of conduct, but I don't think this register would necessarily resolve that issue.
In brief, I think the voluntary approach of a voluntary register and a voluntary code of conduct sets a very high bar and has been proven to be working. I think the committee hopefully needs to be mindful of the next steps and over the course of this inquiry what recommendations it puts forward to the Scottish Government before it starts to draft the bill. And to echo Alistair and Iliam's point, I think any company or organisation looking to engage with individual MSPs, with the Scottish Parliament, Scottish Government, are simply looking for a fair hearing, a chance to put forward their view as they see it, get a fair hearing, and for them to be listened to so that MSPs can make up their own mind about what is the best way for them to go forward. And I think it would be regrettable if barriers were put up which would then have an impact, a detrimental impact, in the way that Parliament and Government works.
Thank you very much. That brings our evidence session to a conclusion. Thank you for attending. We now move into a private session that ends the public part of the meeting.